Hey, hi, how's it going? If you've been here before and you're back for more, I appreciate you to my very core. But if you're new here, welcome. My name is Becca, and I tell your own personal paranormal experiences through short stories. If you have a personal paranormal experience that you'd like me to share and be featured on this channel, make sure to message me on Instagram. The link is in the bio. Without further ado, boop, 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 here is today's story. In 2012, Brooke, who was 17 at the time, lived with her parents in Granite City, Illinois. Brooke had a really close group of friends that consisted of Eve being her best friend and three other friends that made this really close-knit group. One night, Eve called Brooke and said, "Hey, myself and three of our other friends are going to Horseshoe Lake. Would you like to come with us?" Now, Horseshoe Lake is known to be a very local spot. Not a lot of tourists know about this place. And to Brooke and Eve, this was like their special meeting place with their friends. They hung out here all the time. So Brooke, being excited to hang out with her friends, said, "Absolutely, I'll be right there." So Brooke packed her stuff, she hopped in her car and drove to Horseshoe Lake. Once she arrived, she met up with Eve and their three other friends, and they started walking towards the lake. Now, on multiple occasions, they would bring their Ouija board and kind of just mess around with it, as it was a pretty spooky location. It was pretty secluded. And all the times that they had brought this Ouija board to this location, nothing had really happened. So they go to the spot that they normally set up this Ouija board. They place the Ouija board down on this flat area of land by the lake. They put the planchette on top and they begin starting their Ouija board session. After about 20 minutes and no activity, they were like, "You know what? Why don't we leave Horseshoe Lake and let's go to the cemetery just down the road?" Brooke was kind of reluctant as Horseshoe Lake was pretty creepy in itself, but taking a Ouija board to a cemetery, she knew deep down inside this was not a good idea. But after some persuading from her friends, she reluctantly agreed to go. So they all grabbed their belongings, hopped in their vehicles, and drove to the local cemetery that was about 7 minutes away from Horseshoe Lake. Once they arrived at the cemetery, they walked into the cemetery and they were looking for like a really flat area of land that they could perform this Ouija board session on. Once they were walking around the cemetery for about 5 to 10 minutes, they found this perfect flat spot to set the Ouija board on, and they began to remove the Ouija board from the box. They then placed the Ouija board on this flat area. They then placed the planchette on top of the Ouija board and began to sit around the Ouija board to begin their session. Once all the friends were seated around the Ouija board, before they could even place their hands on the planchette began to move. With absolutely nobody touching the planchette, it violently spelled out, "Get out." Absolutely horrified with what they had just witnessed, they grabbed their stuff, they grabbed the Ouija board, and ran right back to their vehicles. Once they were in their vehicles, they kind of debriefed as to what they had just experienced. And everyone agreed. It spelled out, "Get out." A couple months later, some really unexplainable things started happening in Brooke's home, which she now correlates to this Ouija board session. So, about 2 months after this Ouija board session in the cemetery, Brooke was getting ready for school in her grandmother's room. Brooke loved getting ready for school in her grandmother's room. As she was getting ready, she was able to talk to her grandmother about what her plans were for the day, and it was just something that they created a routine of doing. So as Brooke was getting ready, she lit up a cigarette, as she was a smoker at the time, and took a puff and placed the cigarette into the ashtray that was sitting on the dresser. She then turned away from the ashtray, continued to get ready, and turned back to have another puff of her smoke when she realized that the ashtray and her smoke were gone. Both herself and her grandmother realized that this ashtray with this lit cigarette in it is just gone. So Brooke kind of panics, knowing that this could cause a fire. Maybe it fell off the dresser, starts looking around the dresser area, under the bed. Maybe it rolled without them hearing. But after 20 minutes of looking for this ashtray and smoke, they couldn't find it. And Brooke was already running late for school, so she finished getting ready fairly quickly and headed off to school for the day. When Brooke returned home from school that day, she was talking to her grandmother about how weird it was. She couldn't stop thinking about the ashtray that just vanished in thin air. So they both got up from the kitchen table, walked into her grandmother's bedroom, where the ashtray was sitting exactly where it had disappeared earlier in the morning. Absolutely confused at the fact that it had just reappeared and it's here now, knowing that it was gone before, kind of had them a little bit dumbfounded. But they ultimately just brushed it off and kind of forgot about it. A couple days later, Brooke's uncle came over for a visit and they were telling him about how this ashtray just vanished and then it just reappeared. And the uncle was like, "Well, I've heard of this EMF detector app where you can download it onto your phone and it works exactly like a normal EMF detector would." EMF stands for electromagnetic field, and it's used in a lot of paranormal investigations as it's associated with spirits. So if there's a spirit present, the EMF detector will read a very high reading. So joking around, the uncle downloads this EMF reader app and starts walking around the house with it. The whole time he's walking around the house, there's no activity spikes on this EMF app until he reached the grandmother's bedroom. The second he reached the grandmother's bedroom, it went to the highest reading it could possibly go. So he stepped outside of the bedroom and it would go back to normal. Then he would step back into the grandmother's bedroom where it produced this ridiculously high reading. All of them were pretty taken back at this experience, and the uncle kind of looked at them and said, maybe this is why your ashtray just vanished in thin air. 2 days after this experience, Brooke was sleeping in her bed and she was woken up in the middle of the night. When she was woken up, she remembers feeling absolutely terrified because she was unable to move her arms or legs. She wasn't able to speak. The only thing that she could move were her eyes. With her heart pounding through her chest and her entire body drenched in sweat, she, in a panicked state, started looking around her room. After about 5 minutes of the sleep paralysis, it finally lifts and Brooke shoots out of bed and runs straight to her grandmother's room. When she gets into her grandmother's room, she's in complete hysterics and her grandmother wakes up. She explains to her grandmother what she had just experienced and that she doesn't want to go back in that room tonight. So her grandmother invites her to sleep with her in her bedroom for that night. Brooke tried to fall back to sleep in her grandmother's room, but she just kept reliving what she had just gone through. So Brooke would spend that day just completely exhausted and still reliving that night's terrors that she had experienced. That night, Brooke went to bed in her bedroom and her grandmother in hers. It wouldn't be until the morning where Brooke would find out some horrifying information. That night, when her grandmother had gone to sleep, she was awoken in the middle of the night with sleep paralysis that matched the exact story of what Brooke had experienced the night before. The grandmother didn't want to startle Brooke, so she didn't wake up Brooke in the middle of the night to tell her what she had experienced. Instead, the grandma was left quite terrified, wide awake for the rest of the night. So after Brooke hears that her grandmother had experienced the exact same thing, she starts to think about how this thing could have followed her from the cemetery. That's when she remembers. That night at the cemetery, Eve, her friend, had asked everyone surrounding the Ouija board to place a personal item on the board. Brooke had removed her eyebrow ring and placed it on the board. To this day, nothing else has happened in that home, and there was no saging ceremony or blessing performed. It just seemed to kind of stop on its own. But one thing is for certain, and that is the fact that Brooke will never even step foot into the same room as a Ouija board ever again. If you enjoyed today's recording, please leave a like or a comment. It's super rewarding. Wishing you nothing but a beautiful, blissful day. See you all on Tuesday. Bye-bye.